Three oil tankers are burning in the narrow waters of the Persian Gulf. Commercial ships are suddenly turning around before entering the Strait of Hormuz. And oil markets are swinging wildly, surging toward triple-digit prices, then crashing within hours on rumors of a ceasefire. Most headlines are still describing this as a regional war between Israel, the United States, and Iran. But that description misses the real story. Because this is no longer just a war in the Middle East. It is a crisis centered on the single most important energy choke point on the planet. And once that choke point becomes unstable, the consequences do not stay in the region. They ripple across the global economy. Fuel prices, shipping routes, inflation, financial markets. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply. That means every escalation in this war is now tied directly to the arteries of the global energy system. And here is the contradiction. Officials are already suggesting the conflict might end soon. But the economic shock is already spreading. Because once shipping stops trusting a choke point, restarting it is far harder than stopping it. So today, we need to look beyond the headlines. What actually changed in the last few days? Why are oil markets reacting so violently? And why the world may already be facing the early stages of a global energy shock. If you're not subscribed yet and you want clear analysis when global crises unfold, now is the time. Let's rewind the timeline. The chain of events began with a dramatic escalation between Israel, the United States, and Iran. Israel launched large-scale strikes on Iranian military infrastructure. These attacks reportedly targeted missile facilities, drone production sites, and command structures linked to Iran's regional military network. Shortly afterward, the United States joined the campaign. American forces carried out strikes aimed at degrading Iran's military capabilities and limiting its ability to retaliate across the region. Official messaging from Washington and its allies emphasized one idea. This was supposed to be limited, a contained operation, a short campaign designed to weaken Iran's military reach. But Iran responded exactly the way regional powers often do when they face direct military pressure. It widened the battlefield. Iranian missiles and drones began targeting sites connected to U.S. or Israeli interests across the broader Middle East. Reports emerged of attacks in multiple theaters: Lebanon, Iraq, and waters near the Persian Gulf. But the most consequential move was not necessarily a missile strike. It was something far more strategic. Iran signaled that commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz might no longer be safe. And that single signal was enough to shake the entire global energy system. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It sits between Iran to the north and Oman and the United Arab Emirates to the south. Every day, massive oil tankers pass through this corridor, carrying crude from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. Roughly 20% of the world's oil flows through this passage. One narrow stretch of water moves 1/5 of global supply. That means any disruption here instantly becomes a global economic event. Historically, this strait has always been a pressure point. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the region experienced what became known as the Tanker War. Ships were attacked. Mines were deployed. Insurance rates exploded. The United States eventually had to escort tankers through the strait. For decades since then, the assumption has been that global naval power, particularly the U.S. Navy, would keep Hormuz open. But assumptions tend to collapse quickly during wartime. And that may be exactly what is happening now. In the past few days, several commercial vessels have reportedly been attacked near the Strait of Hormuz. Details remain limited and investigations are still ongoing. But the psychological effect on global shipping has already been dramatic. Shipping companies are among the most risk-sensitive actors in the global economy. They respond quickly to danger. And the moment insurance companies begin raising premiums or issuing warnings, ship captains start making different decisions. Commercial traffic through the strait has already dropped sharply. Some ships are delaying entry into the Gulf. Others are rerouting entirely. Some vessels that were already inside Gulf waters are now waiting offshore rather than risking the narrow corridor. This is exactly how choke point crises begin. Not necessarily with a formal blockade, but with fear. Fear changes behavior, and behavior changes the flow of energy. Once tankers start hesitating, supply chains immediately feel the pressure. And that pressure shows up almost instantly in energy markets. Energy markets respond to risk faster than almost any other part of the global economy. Traders do not wait for a full shutdown of supply. They price the possibility. Oil prices surged dramatically as traders tried to calculate what a disruption in Hormuz might mean. But the movement wasn't only upward. Prices swung violently. One headline suggesting escalation pushes prices higher. Another hint of a possible ceasefire sends them plunging. This type of volatility signals uncertainty. Markets are trying to price a risk that nobody fully understands yet, and governments around the world are now preparing contingency plans. Energy officials have begun discussing the potential release of strategic oil reserves. These reserves exist specifically for moments like this. They are emergency buffers designed to stabilize markets during major disruptions. Countries do not even consider using them unless the threat is serious. Now step back for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional shipping route. It is a pillar of the modern global economy. China imports massive amounts of Middle Eastern oil through Hormuz. India depends heavily on the same corridor. Japan and South Korea rely on these flows as well. Europe, after reducing dependence on Russian energy in recent years, has also increased reliance on Middle Eastern supply. So a Hormuz disruption immediately becomes a global issue. Every major power is watching closely. For the United States, the situation is strategic. The U.S. Navy maintains overwhelming naval power in the region, but protecting every commercial vessel in wartime conditions is a complex mission. For Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the stakes are existential. Their economies depend on exporting oil through this corridor. And for Iran, the strait represents one of its most powerful strategic levers. Iran cannot easily defeat the United States in a conventional war, but it can threaten the flow of oil. Iran does not need to permanently close the strait. It only needs to make it unpredictable. When energy choke points become unstable, the consequences move quickly through the global economy. The first impact appears in fuel prices. Gasoline and diesel prices rise alongside crude oil. Airlines pay more for jet fuel. Shipping companies pay more for bunker fuel. Truck transportation becomes more expensive. Then the second wave begins. Higher transportation costs push up the price of goods, food, electronics, construction materials, anything that depends on shipping. And that feeds directly into inflation, which eventually affects interest rates, financial markets, and consumer spending. In other words, what begins as a naval crisis in the Persian Gulf can show up in grocery store prices thousands of miles away. From here, the crisis could move in two very different directions. The first path is containment. International pressure could push the conflict toward de-escalation. Major powers, including Europe, China, and Gulf states, all have strong incentives to prevent a full energy crisis. Naval patrols could increase. Shipping escorts could stabilize traffic. Insurance markets could calm. Under that scenario, the strait remains open. Oil markets stabilize, and the war gradually shifts toward diplomatic negotiations. But there is a second path, and it is far more dangerous. If attacks on shipping continue, the strait could effectively close, even without an official blockade. Iran could deploy naval mines. Small attack boats could target tankers. Drones or missiles could threaten vessels entering the corridor. At that point, the U.S. Navy would likely launch large-scale operations to secure the waterway. The Strait of Hormuz would become an active military theater, and the global oil market would immediately feel the shock. Such a scenario could trigger the most serious energy disruption since the oil crises of the 1970s. The official narrative says this conflict might be limited, a short war, a contained operation. But the reality on the ground suggests something else. Because the world's most important energy choke point is already under pressure. Commercial shipping is reacting. Oil markets are swinging. Governments are discussing emergency reserves. Once energy choke points become unstable, restoring confidence can take far longer than the conflict that triggered the crisis. This is not just a military story. It is an economic one, a geopolitical one, and possibly the opening chapter of a much larger global disruption. So the real questions now are these. Can the Strait of Hormuz remain open if this war continues? Will global powers force a ceasefire before oil markets spiral again? And if the choke point truly closes, how long could the world economy absorb the shock? If you found this analysis useful, subscribe and join the discussion below.